Rome, the 1st century. Inside a palace so vast that ancient writers said it made the rest of the city look like a suburb, one man held more absolute power over more human lives than almost anyone in history. His name was Nero. And behind the marble columns and gilded ceilings of his palace, hundreds of enslaved people lived entirely at his mercy, cooking his meals, dressing his body, managing his household, and, in many documented cases, existing purely for his personal use. What ancient historians recorded about how Nero actually treated the people inside his own household is stranger, darker, and more revealing than almost anything you'll find in the popular image of the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. Today we're going beyond that legend into what Roman sources, writers who lived through his reign or shortly after it, actually documented about life inside Nero's palace, particularly for the enslaved women who served him. Some of what you're about to hear is disturbing, not because it's exaggerated, but because it wasn't considered unusual at the time at all. To understand what happened inside Nero's palace, you first need to understand the sheer scale of it. After a fire destroyed much of Rome in the year 64, Nero built an enormous new residence known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Ancient writers described a complex so massive it included artificial lakes, forests, and a rotating dining room ceiling designed to mimic the movement of the sky. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing decades later, recorded that contemporaries joked bitterly that all of Rome was being swallowed by a single house. Running a residence of that scale required an enormous enslaved workforce. Historians estimate that wealthy Roman households, and especially the imperial household, could include hundreds of enslaved people performing every conceivable task: food preparation, cleaning, childcare, hairdressing, entertainment, secretarial work, and more. Inside the emperor's household specifically, this workforce was known as the Familia Caesaris, literally the family of Caesar, a term that sounds almost affectionate, but described people who were, under Roman law, property. And this is where the story gets genuinely unsettling, because the emperor's personal household wasn't governed by ordinary social expectations. It was governed by whatever the emperor himself decided, and Nero's decisions, according to multiple Roman sources, were often driven by impulse, cruelty, and a total disregard for the people around him. Let's start with the women specifically, because ancient sources give us more detail here than you might expect. Not because Roman writers cared about the women themselves, but because they were using stories about Nero's household to illustrate what they saw as his moral collapse. The historian Tacitus, writing his Annals not long after Nero's death, describes an atmosphere inside the palace where enslaved women served every private need of the emperor and his inner circle, with essentially no legal standing to refuse. Roman law at this time, as we've covered in earlier videos, gave masters near total authority over enslaved people's bodies. Inside an ordinary household, that already meant enslaved women had no legal right to refuse their owner. Inside the emperor's household, where the owner was the single most powerful person in the entire empire, that imbalance became almost unimaginable. Ancient sources describe Nero's personal habits as increasingly erratic as his reign progressed. Suetonius records that Nero would reportedly wander the streets of Rome in disguise at night, and separately describes behavior inside the palace that shocked even a Roman audience already accustomed to imperial excess. While Suetonius's accounts must always be read carefully, he was writing decades after Nero's death, drawing on rumor and hostile political tradition as much as verified fact. Historians agree that even accounting for exaggeration, the pattern of behavior he describes reflects a household where enslaved people, and enslaved women especially, existed with essentially zero protection from the whims of the man they served. One of the most revealing details Roman historians recorded doesn't involve an enslaved woman at all, at first glance, but it tells you everything about how Nero viewed the people around him. After the death of his wife Poppaea Sabina, a death Tacitus suggests may have resulted from Nero's own violence during an argument, Nero reportedly became fixated on a young enslaved boy named Sporus, whom ancient sources describe him having surgically altered to resemble Poppaea, and then presenting publicly as though he were his wife. Cassius Dio and Suetonius both record versions of this story, though again with the caution that our sources were writing to condemn Nero, not simply document him. Why does this matter for understanding what happened to the women inside his household? Because it illustrates, in the starkest possible terms, how Nero treated the human beings around him as objects to be reshaped, reassigned, and controlled entirely according to his own desires, with no distinction, in his mind, between an enslaved person's body and property to be redecorated. If that was how Nero treated someone he apparently held some degree of personal attachment to, ancient historians strongly imply that ordinary enslaved women inside the household, women with no special status, no particular relationship to the emperor, occupied an even more precarious position. There's another figure worth mentioning here because her story shows the other side of this system, the strange, narrow path by which an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman inside Nero's household could actually gain real influence. Her name was Claudia Acte. Ancient sources describe her as a freedwoman, meaning she had been enslaved and later freed, who became one of Nero's early companions, reportedly holding real influence over him during the early years of his reign, before his mother Agrippina's political dominance collapsed. Tacitus mentions her directly, and later, after Nero's death, Acte is recorded as having personally arranged for his burial and cared for his remains, according to Suetonius, one of the few people who appears to have shown him any genuine loyalty at the end. Acte's story matters because it shows the full spectrum of what could happen to a woman who entered Nero's household through slavery. For some, like Acte, there was a path, narrow, uncertain, entirely dependent on the emperor's personal favor, toward genuine standing, freedom, and even influence. But that path existed entirely at Nero's discretion. For every Acte, ancient sources suggest, there were far more enslaved women whose names never appear anywhere in the historical record at all, because their treatment never became politically useful enough for a Roman historian to bother recording it. This absence is, in its own way, one of the most haunting parts of the entire story. Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius were writing primarily to make political and moral arguments about Nero as a ruler, to explain why he was, in their view, unfit to hold power. The enslaved people inside his household appear in their accounts almost entirely as supporting details in that larger argument, not as subjects worth exploring in their own right. We get glimpses, Acte's name, the account of Sporus, general descriptions of the household scale and function, but the actual daily experience of the hundreds of enslaved women who staffed the largest and most powerful household in the Roman world is almost entirely missing from the historical record. What we can reconstruct, carefully, from the sources we do have, is this. These women lived inside a household where the single most powerful man in the empire held absolute legal authority over their bodies, where his documented behavior toward the people closest to him ranged from genuine attachment to what ancient sources describe as violent impulsiveness, and where Roman law offered them no meaningful protection regardless of which mood they happened to encounter him in on any given day. Modern historians studying the imperial household urge caution here, and it's worth repeating that caution clearly. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio were all writing after Nero's death, during periods when criticizing the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors was politically safe, even encouraged. Some of their most dramatic claims about Nero's personal conduct cannot be independently verified, and historians continue to debate how much reflects genuine record-keeping versus hostile political tradition passed down and embellished over decades. But even with that caution firmly in place, the broader structural reality isn't in dispute at all. Roman law during this period gave masters, including and especially the emperor, total legal authority over enslaved people's bodies, with no legal concept of consent applying to that relationship whatsoever. Whatever the precise details of Nero's personal conduct actually were, the women inside his household lived within a legal and social system that offered them no protection from a man. Ancient sources consistently describe as unpredictable, self-indulgent, and increasingly disconnected from any restraint at all as his reign progressed. So when we picture Nero today, the image that usually comes to mind is a fiddle, a fire, and a caricature of imperial madness. But inside the walls of the Golden House, in rooms that never made it into most history books, lived hundreds of women whose entire existence depended on the character of one man. A man Roman historians themselves, writing from a position of considerable hostility, still couldn't agree on whether to describe as a tragic figure or simply a monster. Their names are almost entirely lost. Their daily lives are almost entirely undocumented. And that absence, more than any single dramatic anecdote, might be the truest reflection of what it meant to live as an enslaved woman inside the household of one of Rome's most infamous emperors. If uncovering these overlooked corners of ancient history is the kind of thing that keeps you curious, subscribe. Because there are far more stories like this one still waiting in sources most people never think to explore.